The smell hit you before you even opened the front door. Butter, vanilla, and something magical only December knew.
It's Nestle semi-sweet morsels, extra chocolatey and chewy.
Your grandmother's kitchen, every surface covered in cooling racks, her hands dusted white with flour.
Hot cookies.
Better than Grandma's?
I'm still deciding.
Those Betty Crocker cookies that made Christmas real, the ones your kids will never taste, until now. Why did they call them melting moments? You'd watch your grandmother cream butter and powdered sugar until it looked like clouds. She'd add flour and cornstarch, that secret ingredient that made them dissolve on your tongue like sweet snow. The dough rolled into little balls, each pressed with a fork, making that crisscross pattern every kid wanted to do. They baked pale as winter morning light. When cooled, she'd sandwich two together with butter frosting tinted pink or mint green. These were too delicate for shipping, family only, served on good china. They earned their name the moment they touched your lips. Not a crunch, not a chew, just instant dissolving sweetness. Make them small, she'd say, so folks can have 3 and not feel guilty. Ever pressed dough into those tiny fluted tins? Your grandmother kept them in a wooden box that smelled like almond and age. She'd pinch off bits of buttery dough, press them paper thin with her thumb. The dough was simple: butter, sugar, almond extract, flour, but the method took patience. Those little tins would fill a baking sheet, baking until edges turned golden. The whole house filled with that almond butter smell that meant Christmas was here. After cooling, she'd tap each tin gently, the cookie shell dropping into her palm like a tiny edible bowl. They stacked in tins between waxed paper, crisp and nutty. Your grandmother's Norwegian mother taught her these, and her mother before that, cookies that crossed an ocean in someone's memory. Why did the dough have to sleep in the icebox overnight? Your grandmother would mix dark molasses with butter and sugar, the thick brown syrup dripping slow like winter itself. She'd add ginger, cinnamon, and cloves. So much spice you could smell Christmas coming together, but you couldn't roll them yet. Into the refrigerator the dough went, wrapped in waxed paper, resting overnight. It needs time to think about what it wants to be, she'd joke. Cold dough rolled thinner, cut cleaner, baked up crisp instead of puffy. The next day, she'd cut shapes with cookie cutters passed down from her mother. They came out dark and spicy and strong, cookies with backbone meant to last through long winters. She'd pack them in tins with popcorn for cushioning, carrying her kitchen 3 states over. Dark molasses only, she'd insist. Who decided to put jam in the middle? Your grandmother would cream butter and sugar, then add egg yolks, saving the whites because nothing went to waste. She'd mix in almond extract and flour, then roll the dough into walnut-sized balls. The egg whites got beaten frothy, each ball taking a quick bath before rolling through chopped pecans. Those nuts stuck like they'd been glued there. Here's where you got to help, pressing your thumb into the center, making a well for the jam. Raspberry was traditional, but she used whatever she'd put up that summer. Halfway through baking, she'd press the centers again, add more jam. They cooled, looking like jewels on a tray, each one a small gift of butter and fruit. Press gentle, she'd remind you, or you'll punch straight through. Why did rolling them in cinnamon sugar feel like coating treasure? Your grandmother's weren't like the flat ones you see now. These were thick and soft, with tops that cracked like desert earth. She'd cream butter with sugar, add eggs, then flour with cream of tartar and baking soda. That cream of tartar was essential, the secret to that tangy flavor underneath the cinnamon. Each ball got rolled in cinnamon sugar until completely coated. Into the oven they went, and you'd watch as they puffed up, then cracked across the top. The smell filled the whole house. Cinnamon and butter making everyone wander to the kitchen. They came out puffy and soft, staying that way even after cooling. Who was Ethel, and why were her sugar cookies legendary? Nobody remembered Ethel's last name, but every woman in town had her recipe on a butter-stained index card. These weren't rolled. They were drop cookies, faster and less fuss. She'd cream butter and sugar until almost white, add 2 eggs, and a full tablespoon of vanilla. The flour included baking powder and just a touch of nutmeg. The dough dropped by spoonfuls. Then came Ethel's trick, the bottom of a glass dipped in sugar, pressed down to flatten each mound. 8 to 10 minutes in the oven, watching until edges just barely turned golden. These looked plain, almost boring compared to fancy-shaped cookies, but that first bite told you everything. Buttery, tender, with that subtle nutmeg warmth and enough vanilla to make you close your eyes. Ethel knew what she was doing, your grandmother would say. Fancy doesn't always mean better. Why did she guard that cookie press like it was made of gold? Your grandmother kept her cookie press in its original box from 1952, stored on the top shelf. Making spritz meant Christmas was officially underway. The dough was particular. Butter softened but not melted, creamed with sugar until exactly right. She'd add almond extract, then flour. She'd load the press, squeeze out perfect shapes directly onto cookie sheets. Each cookie had to be identical. Into the oven for just 8 minutes, barely long enough to set. They stayed pale on top, delicate as Swedish lace. Some got dipped in chocolate, others sprinkled with colored sugar. The cookie press made dozens in the time it took to roll other cookies, efficiency disguised as elegance. A good press is an investment, she'd say. Treat it right and it'll outlast you. Which one takes you back most? Tell us in the comments. We want to hear your grandmother's cookie secrets. Ever try to twist together red and white dough without mixing them into pink? Your grandmother would make 2 batches, one plain, one red, both with peppermint extract strong enough to make your eyes water. She'd roll them into ropes, twist them together without blending the colors, then curve them into canes. These took real time. Each cane was individual, hand-shaped. She'd sit at the kitchen table working through pounds of dough, 1 cane at a time. They baked quickly, coming out with stripes intact, and that peppermint smell strong enough to clear sinuses. She'd hang them on the Christmas tree as ornaments, and by Christmas Eve, half would be gone. Patience makes perfect canes, she'd say, but perfect isn't as important as making them together. Why did she make logs of dough a week before baking? Your grandmother believed in being prepared, and these were her secret weapon against unexpected company. She'd make the dough in early December, butter, sugar, eggs, vanilla, flour, forming logs that stored in the refrigerator. Company showed up? Slice off what you needed. The dough kept for 2 weeks, and you could slice thin or thick for crispy or chewy. Some batches she'd roll in chopped nuts before wrapping. 10 minutes in the oven and they were done. Golden edges, tender centers, pure vanilla flavor. The Betty Crocker cookbook called them emergency cookies, but there was nothing desperate about smart planning. Make extra logs, she'd advise. She'd give logs of unbaked dough to new brides, teaching them this trick for easy hospitality. Why did they have 3 different names for the same cookie? Your grandmother called them Russian tea cakes. Her neighbor called them Mexican wedding cookies. The church ladies called them butterballs. Same recipe, different origin stories, but everyone agreed they were essential to Christmas. She'd cream butter and powdered sugar. In the dough, not regular sugar, then add vanilla and finely chopped pecans. The dough came together soft and crumbly, shaped into walnut-sized balls. They baked until set, but still pale. While still warm, she'd roll them in powdered sugar. That first coating melted slightly into the cookie. After cooling completely, she'd rolled them again, coating them thick as fresh snow. Bite into one and it would practically dissolve, that powdered sugar dusting your lips. "Don't skip that second roll in the sugar," she'd warn. "That's what makes them beautiful." And she was right. Those cookies needed their snow. How did she get that lemon flavor so bright in the middle of winter? Your grandmother would wait for lemons to go on sale, then buy them by the bag because these demanded real lemon, zest and juice. She'd cream butter and sugar, add eggs and fresh lemon zest grated right over the bowl. The dough was soft, shaped into balls and baked until bottoms turned golden, but tops stayed pale. After cooling, she'd make a glaze, powdered sugar, butter, lemon juice, dipping each cookie top down. The glaze set into a crackled finish like ice crystals. These weren't traditional Christmas cookies in the fruitcake and gingerbread sense. They were bright and fresh, cutting through heavy winter food with citrus sunshine. "When everything tastes like cinnamon and chocolate, bring out the lemon," she'd say. The key was not overbaking them. 10 minutes maximum. "Lemons in winter are a gift," she'd say. "They remind you spring is coming, even when it's buried under snow." Why were they called poor man's cookies when they took so much work? Your grandmother's Norwegian grandmother brought this recipe across the ocean in her memory. These were thin dough twisted into knots and fried until golden. The dough started with egg yolks beaten with sugar, then cream and a splash of brandy. Cardamom filled the kitchen with that warm, floral spice smell. The dough rolled paper thin, cut into diamonds with a slit in the center. One point pulled through to create a twisted knot. They fried for seconds, turned golden immediately, then got dusted with powdered sugar while hot. They'd pile up on the platter, crispy and light as air. One bite and they'd practically dissolve. These were Christmas Eve tradition, made fresh and eaten all. "Watch the oil temperature," she'd warn. Work that connected her to her grandmother and her great-grandmother before that, women who'd made these same cookies in much harder times. The name might have meant poor, but the tradition was rich beyond measure. Ever wonder why these cookies had pictures pressed into their tops? Your grandmother owned wooden molds carved with intricate designs from her German aunt. These required no butter, just eggs beaten with sugar until thick, then anise extract and flour. The dough rolled out thick, pressed with those carved molds, creating pictures, Santa Claus, Christmas trees, angels. After cutting, they sat out overnight, uncovered, developing a slight crust. The next day they baked slowly until firm but still pale, those pressed designs still clear. The anise flavor was strong, not for everyone, but those who loved it really loved it. Your grandmother treated these molds like heirlooms, wrapping them carefully after each use. "These cookies tell stories," she'd say, pointing to the designs. Making them was slow work, but when December rolled around and you saw those molds come out, you knew Christmas was really coming. How did she get those perfect striped layers? Your grandmother made these to show off a little. 3 flavors layered together, sliced to show stripes. She'd divide butter cookie dough into thirds. One stayed plain, one got chocolate, one got almond extract and red food coloring, making it pink. She'd roll each into rectangles, stack or roll them together, then chill overnight. The next day she'd slice thin, revealing spirals or stripes inside. 10 minutes in the oven, and they looked like something from a fancy bakery. The trick was keeping colors distinct. If the dough got too soft, the layers would blend into a muddy mess. Work fast, chill thoroughly, slice cleanly. "It's not hard," she'd say. "It just takes planning." These represented her generation's idea that effort shows, that making something beautiful was worth it. Why did no-bake cookies feel like cheating until you tasted them? Your grandmother wasn't above a good shortcut, especially during those last frantic days before Christmas. These came together in 20 minutes, required no oven. She'd melt butter and marshmallows, add green food coloring, then stir in cornflakes. Working fast with buttered hands, she'd shape wreaths, poking holes in centers, decorating each with 3 red cinnamon candies for holly berries. Kids loved making these. No hot oven, just sticky hands and sugar. The finished wreaths were crunchy and sweet, more candy than cookie. "There's no shame in easy," she'd say. "Not everything has to be difficult to be good." And she was right. These existed in a different category, holiday treats that brought joy without requiring the full production of a baking day. Why were these cookies kept in the back of the pantry behind the flour? Your grandmother made these for the adults, the ones who appreciated a cookie with bite that wasn't from ginger or cinnamon. These weren't baked. They were assembled from crushed vanilla wafers, chopped pecans, cocoa powder, and enough bourbon to make them distinctly not for children. She'd mix everything together with corn syrup to bind it, then roll the mixture into balls and coat them in powdered sugar. Into a tin they went, stored in the cool pantry where they'd sit for at least a week before serving. The waiting was essential. Fresh bourbon balls tasted harsh, the alcohol too sharp, the flavors not melded together. But after a week in that tin, something magical happened. The vanilla wafers absorbed the bourbon, the pecans softened slightly, the cocoa bloomed, and everything became smooth and sophisticated. These were cookies that improved with age, getting better every day they sat. Your grandmother would bring them out at Christmas Eve dinner, setting the tin on the sideboard where only the adults could reach. Kids weren't explicitly told they couldn't have them, but somehow everyone understood these weren't for young palates. The smell alone, that bourbon-cocoa-pecan mixture, warned you these were grown-up treats. She'd make them in early December, 2 or 3 batches, storing them in separate tins because they'd all get eaten before Christmas rolled around. Men who claimed they didn't like sweets would eat handful after handful of these. Women who said they were watching their figure would sneak one, then another, then ask for the recipe. The recipe itself was simple, almost embarrassingly so. Crush cookies, chop nuts, mix with cocoa and bourbon, roll into balls, dust with sugar. But the simplicity was deceptive. The ratio of wet to dry had to be exact, or they'd fall apart. The bourbon couldn't be cheap. Bad bourbon made bad cookies. The waiting period was non-negotiable. These were cookies that taught patience and rewarded it. "They're not for every day," your grandmother would say, tucking the tin back behind the flour sack. Why did she have that drawer full of tiny tart pans? Your grandmother's miniature tart pans lived in the bottom drawer, wrapped in a flour sack towel, dozens of them collected over decades. Making these filled tarts was an afternoon project, starting with a cream cheese pastry dough that she'd press into each little pan, creating tiny cups barely bigger than a thimble. The dough was rich and tender, more like pie crust than cookie dough, made with butter, cream cheese, and just enough flour to hold it together. Each pan got lined carefully, the dough pressed thin against the fluted edges, creating delicate shells ready for filling. She'd make different fillings depending on what she had. Sometimes it was pecan pie filling, thick with corn syrup and chopped nuts. Other times it was mincemeat, that dark, spicy mixture that people either loved or hated with no middle ground. Occasionally she'd do lemon curd or cherry preserves, but the traditional ones were pecan or mincemeat. A small spoonful of filling went into each shell, not quite full because they'd bubble up during baking. Into the oven they went, the pastry browning around the edges while the filling set. After cooling, she'd run a knife around each tart and pop them out of their pans, dozens of miniature pies that looked almost too perfect to eat. These were elegant cookies, the kind you'd serve at a fancy tea or a formal Christmas gathering. They required more work than drop cookies or even rolled cookies. All that pressing into individual pans, all that filling, all that careful removal. But they were impressive, and your grandmother knew the value of impressive when company came. She'd learned to make them from a church cookbook in the 1950s, back when ladies' groups competed politely over whose Christmas spread was most refined. These tarts won competitions. They showed skill, patience, and access to the right equipment. How did those cookies crack open like the earth after a drought? Your grandmother's chocolate crinkles were deeply chocolate, made with real cocoa powder and melted baking chocolate, creating a dough so rich and dark it was almost black. She'd mix in eggs, sugar, vanilla, and just enough flour to hold it together, then refrigerate the whole bowl overnight. The dough needed to be cold, almost too firm to work with, because what happened next required specific conditions. The next day, she'd scoop out portions of that stiff, cold dough and roll them into balls, then roll each ball in powdered sugar until completely white. They looked like snowballs going onto the baking sheet, pure white and perfect. But the magic happened in the oven. As they baked, the cookies spread and cracked, the dark chocolate dough breaking through that white sugar coating in dramatic fissures that looked like lightning or dried earth or broken ice. The contrast was striking, dark brown showing through bright white, creating a pattern unique to each cookie. No two cracked exactly the same way, making each one individual, beautiful in its own random pattern. They came out of the oven looking dramatic and tasting intensely chocolate, with that sugar coating adding sweetness and a slight crunch to the soft, fudgy interior. These were showstopper cookies. People would see them on a tray and stop, asking what they were, how you made them. The answer sounded simple: chocolate dough rolled in sugar. But achieving that perfect crack required cold dough, hot oven, and the right amount of sugar coating. Too warm, and they'd spread too much. Too cool, and they wouldn't crack. The timing had to be exact. Your grandmother would make them on days when she wanted to impress, when the cookie exchange needed something dramatic, when the church baking sale required entries that would sell first. They always did. Kids loved them because they were chocolate. Adults loved them because they were sophisticated chocolate, not too sweet, with real depth of flavor. The Betty Crocker version suggested adding nuts, but your grandmother was a purist. These cookies were about chocolate and contrast, about that visual drama of dark and light. Adding nuts would distract from their purpose. She'd pack them carefully in tins, layering them between waxed paper so that sugar coating wouldn't get smudged. They were too beautiful to treat carelessly, too impressive to risk damaging before they reached their destination. Some cookies were just special, and these were among them. Next came the cookie that nobody else brought to exchanges. Why did these cookies have hard-boiled egg yolks in the dough? Your grandmother's Scandinavian heritage showed up in these delicate wreaths, another recipe that traveled across an ocean in someone's memory. The dough started unusual. Butter creamed with sugar, then 2 hard-boiled egg yolks pressed through a sieve and mixed in along with 2 raw egg yolks. The cooked yolks gave the dough a unique, tender texture and a subtle richness that raw eggs alone couldn't provide. Add vanilla and flour, and you had a dough that felt almost like Play-Doh, smooth and pliable and easy to work. She'd pinch off small pieces and roll them into ropes about as thick as a pencil and 4 inches long. Each rope got shaped into a wreath, the ends overlapping and pressed together. One end would get dipped into beaten egg white, then into coarse sugar and chopped almonds before being pressed onto the other end, creating a little decorated clasp that made the wreath look finished and purposeful. They baked quickly at moderate heat, coming out pale golden with that sparkly sugar nut clasp catching the light. The texture was tender and fine-grained, almost shortbread-like but lighter. Your grandmother only made them once a year because the process took so long, but they were always worth it. People would pick them up, admire them, ask about the recipe. She'd explain about the hard-boiled egg yolks, and people would look skeptical until they tasted one. Then they understood. The Betty Crocker version of this recipe appeared in the 1950s cookbook, but your grandmother's version came from her mother, who'd learned it from her mother, and the slight differences, a bit more butter, a touch more vanilla, were what made them hers. These cookies connected her to women she'd never met, grandmothers in the old country who'd shaped these same wreaths in kitchens she'd never seen. Some recipes are food, some are history you can taste. Now, let's talk about the cookies that used what you had on hand. Why did these cookies use only egg whites and no flour? Your grandmother saved egg whites in a jar in the refrigerator, adding to it every time a recipe called for only yolks. Once she had enough, usually about 4 or 5, it was time to make coconut macaroons. These cookies were as much about using what would otherwise go to waste as they were about the finished product. The recipe was simple. Beat egg whites with sugar and vanilla until stiff. Fold in shredded coconut, drop by spoonfuls onto a baking sheet. But simple didn't mean easy. The egg whites had to be beaten to exactly the right consistency, stiff enough to hold their shape, but not so dry they'd break apart when you folded in the coconut. Too loose, and the cookies would spread flat. Too stiff, and they'd be dense. Your grandmother could tell by looking by the way the whites held on the beater when they were ready. The coconut, always the sweetened kind from the bag, never fresh, got folded in gently, maintaining as much air as possible. She'd use a spoon to drop mounds onto parchment paper, shaping each one into a rough pyramid. Into a moderate oven they went, baking until golden brown on the outside while staying soft and chewy inside. These were cookies that improved with age. Fresh from the oven, they were good. The next day, they were better. The coconut had time to soften further, the flavors to meld, the texture to become more uniform. She'd store them in a tin, and they'd keep for over a week, getting chewier and more concentrated in flavor. Macaroons were reliable. They didn't require butter when butter was expensive. They used up egg white that would otherwise go bad. They needed no flour when flour was being saved for bread. They were Depression-era practical, wartime thrifty, but they tasted like abundance, sweet, rich, satisfying. Your grandmother would sometimes dip the bottoms in melted chocolate after they cooled, making them fancy enough for gift-giving. Other times, she'd leave them plain, their golden color and rough texture speaking for themselves. Both versions had their place. "Waste nothing," she'd say, pouring another egg white into her jar. "These cookies are proof you can make something from what others throw away." And she meant it. In her kitchen, nothing was wasted. Egg whites became cookies. Stale bread became pudding. Vegetable scraps became soup stock. This wasn't poverty. It was intelligence, the kind of wisdom that came from living through times when waste meant hunger. The Betty Crocker version suggested adding almond extract, but your grandmother kept hers pure vanilla and coconut. She said you shouldn't complicate something that was already perfect. Sometimes the smartest thing was knowing when to leave something alone. These cookies taught resourcefulness disguised as dessert. They were lessons in making do, in creativity born from necessity, in the beauty of simplicity. And just when you thought all the simple cookies were covered, why did slicing these cookies feel like opening a present? Your grandmother would make these in late November, storing the logs of dough in the refrigerator until Christmas baking time arrived. The process started with a date filling, chopped dates simmered with sugar, water, and chopped walnuts, until the mixture became thick and spreadable. That filling had to cool completely before you could use it, which meant planning ahead, making the filling one day and the dough another. The cookie dough itself was a basic refrigerator cookie: butter, brown sugar, eggs, vanilla, and flour with a touch of baking soda. She'd divide it in half, rolling each portion into a rectangle about a 1/4 inch thick. The cooled date filling got spread over each rectangle, edge to edge. Then the whole thing rolled up tightly like a jelly roll. The logs got wrapped in waxed paper and chilled until firm, usually overnight. Come baking day, she'd slice each log into rounds about a 1/4 inch thick, revealing that beautiful spiral of date, filling inside pale dough. Onto the baking sheet they went, spaced apart because they'd spread slightly. 10 minutes in a moderate oven and they were done. Golden edges, that dark filling peeking through, looking far more complicated than they actually were. These cookies had a homey, old-fashioned flavor that felt appropriate for Christmas. Dates weren't as popular as they'd been in her mother's generation, but your grandmother kept making them because tradition mattered. The slicing revealed the spiral pattern, and every cookie looked different depending on where you cut it. Some showed more filling, some more dough, but all had that distinctive pinwheel design that gave them their name. Kids would pick them up and examine them before eating, following that spiral with their eyes. Dates make good cookies, your grandmother would say, because they're sweet on their own. You don't need much sugar, and she was right. The filling carried its own sweetness, concentrated and rich. The cookie dough balanced it without competing, creating harmony instead of excess. How could cookies this small pack so much flavor? Your grandmother's pfeffernüsse were tiny, barely bigger than a large marble, but they were mighty. These German spice cookies required a long list of spices: cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, black pepper, and anise. Yes, black pepper. The name literally meant pepper nuts, and she used real pepper, enough to give them a subtle bite underneath all that sweet spice. The dough also included molasses and honey, making it dark and sticky and fragrant enough to perfume the whole kitchen. The dough needed to rest, sometimes for days, wrapped tightly and stored in a cool place, while the spices mellowed and mingled. When she was ready to bake, she'd roll small pieces between her palms, creating balls about the size of a large pea. Onto the baking sheet they went by the dozens, baking at moderate heat until firm. They came out hard, not just crispy hard, but actually hard, meant to be dunked in coffee or tea to soften them slightly before eating. After baking, while they were still warm, she'd toss them in powdered sugar, coating each little ball until it looked like a white pearl. They'd go into tins, where they'd sit for weeks, actually improving with age. Fresh pfeffernüsse were good. Month-old pfeffernüsse were incredible. The spices had time to bloom, the texture to soften slightly, the flavors to become complex and layered. Your grandmother's mother brought this recipe from Germany, and it hadn't changed in 4 generations. The same spices, the same proportions, the same tiny size. These cookies were tradition in its purest form, unchanged because change would be betrayal, made every year because not making them would mean something important was lost. They weren't to everyone's taste. Kids often found them too spicy, too hard, too grown up, but adults who'd grown up with them would eat handful after handful, their faces softening with memory. "Just like my grandmother made," they'd say, and your grandmother would nod, knowing exactly what they meant. The pepper was the surprise. Most people couldn't identify it specifically, but they'd notice something warm and slightly sharp underneath the cinnamon and cloves. That was the pepper, creating complexity, adding depth, making these cookies something more than just another spice cookie. "Let them age," your grandmother would insist, hiding the tins in the back of the pantry. "They need time to become what they're supposed to be," and she was absolutely right. Making pfeffernüsse in November for Christmas wasn't just about having them ready. It was about giving them the time they needed to transform from good cookies into transcendent ones. Betty Crocker's version simplified them, reduced the spices, made them more American-friendly, but your grandmother stuck with the old recipe, the one that required patience and trust, that time would improve what seemed already finished. Some traditions don't need improvement, they need preservation. Now here's the cookie that used every spice in the cabinet. Why did cutting out people feel more important than cutting out other shapes? Your grandmother's gingerbread dough was dark with molasses, stiff with flour, and spiced enough to make your eyes water when you leaned over the bowl. She'd cream butter with brown sugar, add molasses and an egg, then mix in her spice blend: ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and a pinch of cayenne that most people didn't expect. The cayenne wasn't traditional in Betty Crocker's version, but her grandmother had done it, so she did it too, explaining that it gave the ginger something to push against, made it sharper, and more present. The dough needed to chill before rolling, at least 2 hours, preferably overnight. When it was cold and firm, she'd roll it out on a floured board, not too thin or they'd burn, not too thick or they'd be cake-like instead of crisp. Then came the gingerbread man cutter, pressed firmly, lifted carefully, each man going onto the baking sheet with space between because gingerbread spreads. She'd give them faces before baking, raisin eyes, cinnamon candy buttons, sometimes a little piece of candied cherry for a smile. After baking, while they cooled, she'd make royal icing and pipe on details if she had time, shirts, pants, shoes, hair. But the faces went on before baking because they needed to be part of the cookie, not just decoration. These weren't just cookies, they were characters. Your grandmother would tell stories about them while decorating, giving each one a personality, making the kitchen feel like a gingerbread village was being populated. Kids could help with the decorating, their crooked lines and enthusiastic dots giving each cookie its own charm. The smell of gingerbread baking was Christmas itself, spicy, warm, homey. No artificial scent could capture it. No candle could replicate it. It was the real thing, the smell that meant someone was home and baking and Christmas was coming. Gingerbread men were egalitarian cookies. Everyone got one. Kids, adults, visitors, family. They weren't fancy enough to be stingy with, but they were beloved enough to make everyone happy. Bite off the head first or save it for last. Everyone had their method, their preference, their way of eating a gingerbread man that had been established in childhood. Your grandmother would hang some on the Christmas tree with ribbon threaded through holes she'd poked before baking. They'd stay there through the season, getting harder and more decorative as the days passed. By New Year's, they were ornaments more than cookies, but they still smelled like ginger and cloves. Gingerbread people, she'd say, correcting anyone who called them just cookies. They're people. Treat them with respect. And she was half joking, but half serious, too. There was something about cutting out human shapes, decorating faces, giving them characteristics. It made baking feel like creating, not just cooking. These cookies had been made for centuries, and they'd be made for centuries more. But the next cookie was much more recent. What made these cookies wink back at you? Your grandmother discovered these in a Betty Crocker contest winner collection from the 1950s, and they quickly became one of her favorites for their cheerful appearance and perfect balance of flavors. The dough included chopped dates and maraschino cherries along with chopped pecans, creating little jewels of fruit and nut throughout. She'd cream butter with sugar, add eggs and vanilla, then fold in the fruits and nuts before adding the dry ingredients. Here's where they got interesting. Instead of just dropping them onto a baking sheet, she'd roll each ball of dough in crushed cornflakes, coating it completely, so each cookie looked like a golden hedgehog. Then she'd press a wedge of maraschino cherry on top. That was the wink, a bright red eye looking up from the cookie. Into the oven they went, the cornflakes toasting, the cookie spreading slightly but holding its shape, that cherry piece glistening on top. They came out crispy outside from those crushed flakes, chewy inside from the dates and cherries, with a buttery flavor that balanced all that fruit. The crushed cornflakes added texture and a subtle sweet corn taste that complemented rather than competed. These were party cookies. The kind that looked festive on a tray, that invited grabbing, that made people smile. The name alone, Cherry Winks, felt playful, friendly, approachable. Kids loved them because they were colorful and fun. Adults loved them because they tasted complex, despite their silly name. Your grandmother would make them for school parties and church events, anywhere she wanted cookies that looked cheerful without requiring decorating skills. The cornflake coating did all the decorating work, creating texture and visual interest without piping bags or colored frosting. Efficient and beautiful, her favorite combination. The original recipe called for coconut mixed with the cornflakes, but she left it out after your aunt developed an allergy. The cookies were perfect without it, proving that sometimes simplification improves rather than diminishes. These won a contest she'd mention while rolling dough in crushed flakes. Someone was smart enough to think of this, and now we all get to make them. And that was the beauty of contest winner recipes. They entered the common knowledge, became part of everyone's repertoire. The woman who invented cherry winks in the 1950s couldn't have known her cookies would still be made 70 years later in kitchens across America. But they were. That was immortality of a sort. How did she get those perfect straight lines between colors? Your grandmother would make 2 batches of her basic refrigerator cookie dough, 1 chocolate, 1 vanilla, then roll each into rectangles on sheets of waxed paper. The rectangles had to be exactly the same size, measured with a ruler because precision mattered here. Once rolled, she'd stack them, alternating colors, creating a layered block of chocolate and vanilla dough about 3 inches tall. The whole block got wrapped in waxed paper and chilled overnight, the dough firming up until it was solid enough to slice cleanly. The next day, she'd unwrap it and slice straight down, creating cookies with horizontal stripes, chocolate, vanilla. Each slice had to be the same thickness, about 1/4 inch, sliced with a sharp knife dipped in flour between cuts to keep the dough from sticking. These cookies were architectural, geometric, precise, deliberate. They looked like someone who knew what they were doing had made them, which was exactly the point. Your grandmother used them when she wanted to show skill without showing off, demonstrating competence through clean lines and consistent layers. They baked quickly, just until the edges firmed up, coming out with their stripes perfectly intact. The vanilla portions would brown slightly while the chocolate stayed dark, creating even more contrast. On a cookie tray, they looked professional. The kind of cookie you'd expect from a bakery, not a home kitchen. The flavor was straightforward: vanilla and chocolate, butter and sugar, nothing competing for attention. These weren't about complex flavors. They were about technique, about taking simple ingredients and arranging them into something impressive. Your grandmother learned these from a neighbor in the 1960s, during the height of refrigerator cookie popularity, when every home economics class taught the method. Make logs of dough, wrap them, chill them, slice them fresh when you need cookies. It was modern efficiency applied to traditional baking. She'd make multiple logs at once, keeping them in the refrigerator for when company arrived unexpectedly. 10 minutes from fridge to oven to cookie plate was her record, possible only because she'd planned ahead, made that dough last week, kept it ready. The secret is patience and a ruler, she'd say, measuring her dough rectangles. Rush these, and they'll look homemade in the bad way. And she was right. Sloppy ribbon cookies with wavy lines and uneven layers didn't impress anyone, but clean, straight stripes proved you knew what you were doing, that your kitchen was organized, that you'd thought ahead. These cookies represented a particular moment in American cooking, when convenience met presentation, when planning ahead was valued, when the refrigerator was still modern enough to inspire recipe names. They were distinctly mid-century, existing in that sweet spot between homemade and store-bought, between simple and impressive. Your grandmother's logs of dough, wrapped and waiting, represented possibility, the possibility of hospitality, of ready welcomes, of being prepared for life's unexpected guests. But some cookies required no preparation at all. Why did everyone have a different idea about how these should turn out? Your grandmother made chocolate chip cookies exactly according to the Toll House recipe printed on the back of the Nestlé chocolate chip bag, the original, the one Ruth Wakefield created in the 1930s that became the most famous American cookie recipe ever written. She'd cream butter with both white and brown sugar, add eggs and vanilla, then mix in flour, salt, and baking soda. Finally came the chocolate chips and chopped walnuts, stirred in by hand because overmixing would make the cookies tough. But here's where it got interesting. Everyone had opinions about chocolate chip cookies: crispy or chewy, thin or thick, lots of chips or just enough, walnuts or no walnuts. These cookies sparked more kitchen debates than any other, with people defending their preferences like religious doctrine. Your grandmother's came out medium thick, slightly crispy around the edges with chewy centers, studded with chips and nuts throughout. She'd drop them by rounded tablespoons onto ungreased cookie sheets, giving them room to spread. 9 to 11 minutes at 375 degrees, watching through the oven window for that moment when the edges turned golden, but the centers still looked slightly underdone. That's when they came out, finishing their baking on the hot pan while cooling on the counter. The smell of chocolate chip cookies baking could draw people from other rooms, from outside, from sleep. It was a summons, a promise, an announcement that something good was happening in the kitchen. Kids would hover, asking every 30 seconds if they were done yet, willing time to move faster through pure desire. Your grandmother would make these more often than other cookies because they didn't require special occasions. Birthday? Chocolate chip cookies. Bad day at school? Chocolate chip cookies. Company coming? Chocolate chip cookies. They were the utility cookie, the one that fit every situation, that made everyone happy. She'd always make extra dough, scooping it into balls and freezing them on a baking sheet before transferring them to a bag. Then she could bake just a few at a time, having fresh cookies whenever she wanted without the full production. This was advanced strategy, the kind of thinking that made her kitchen always ready for anything. Follow the recipe on the bag, she'd advise anyone asking for instructions. Ruth Wakefield knew what she was doing when she invented these. No need to improve perfection. And while thousands of people had modified the recipe over the decades, adding oats, using different chips, changing the sugar ratios, your grandmother stuck with the original. She figured if it was good enough to become America's favorite cookie, it was good enough for her kitchen. These cookies were democracy in action. Loved by everyone, known by everyone, made by everyone. They crossed all boundaries, transcended all differences, united people in appreciation for chocolate, butter, and sugar baked together until perfect. Some cookies were fancy. These were fundamental. Now here's one that took 3 days to make. Why did these cookies have no flour and need to rest for days? Your grandmother's cinnamon stars were German tradition in its purest form. Egg whites beaten with powdered sugar until stiff, then folded with ground almonds and cinnamon until the mixture formed a dough. No flour, no butter, just meringue and nuts and spice. The dough was sticky, difficult, requiring a surface heavily dusted with powdered sugar to roll it out, and even then it fought you, wanting to stick to everything it touched. She'd roll it thick, about 1/2 inch, then cut out stars with her star-shaped cookie cutter. Each star needed careful lifting, the dough so delicate and temperamental that it could tear if you rushed. They'd sit on the counter overnight, uncovered, developing a slight crust on the surface. Then she'd brush each one with a glaze made from more beaten egg whites and powdered sugar before baking them at low temperature until they were dry, but still white. The finished cookies were unlike any other, crispy, chewy texture, intensely cinnamon-flavored, with a glossy white surface that crackled when you bit through it. They were substantial, despite having no flour, satisfying despite being essentially held together by egg whites and ground nuts. The cinnamon flavor was forward and strong, not subtle or balanced. These cookies announced themselves. Making them was a test of patience and skill. The dough didn't cooperate easily. It stuck. It tore, it required constant attention, but your grandmother persisted because these cookies connected her to her mother's kitchen in Germany, to Christmas mornings before the war, to a time and place she could only visit through recipes now. "They're worth the trouble," she'd say, carefully lifting another star. "Some things should be difficult. It makes them mean more." And she was right. Easy cookies were everywhere. But cookies that required 3 days and sticky dough and careful glazing, those were special. Those were cookies you made because tradition demanded it, because your grandmother made them, because letting them disappear would mean something important was lost. The Betty Crocker version didn't exist. These were too foreign, too difficult, too uncommercial for mainstream American cookbooks. But in German-American kitchens, they appeared every Christmas, made by women who remembered or who'd been taught by women who remembered. These cookies were memory made edible, history you could taste. Now, here's the cookie that needed perfect timing. Why did she switch to the wreath disc just for Christmas? Your grandmother made spritz cookies year-round with different discs, stars for regular days, flowers for spring, hearts for Valentine's. But Christmas meant the wreath disc came out, creating perfect little circular cookies that she'd decorate with red and green sugar or tiny candied cherries arranged to look like holly berries. The dough was identical to her regular spritz. Butter, sugar, egg, almond extract, flour, but the wreath shape transformed them into specifically Christmas cookies. She'd load her cookie press, attach the wreath disc, and squeeze out perfect circles onto ungreased cookie sheets. Each wreath had to be the same size, the same thickness, pressed with the same amount of pressure. Inconsistent pressure meant some cookies would be thick and doughy while others turned out thin and crispy, and your grandmother's reputation couldn't tolerate such variation. Before baking, she'd decorate them. Some got a sprinkle of colored sugar, red or green, never both, because that looked too busy. 8 minutes in the oven, just until the edges started to brown. Then out they came. The wreaths held their shape perfectly, the decorations baked right in, and the almond flavor filled the kitchen with that distinctive spritz smell that meant Christmas was here. Your grandmother would make hundreds of these, literally hundreds. She'd spend an entire day making wreath after wreath, filling tins, packing boxes, setting aside special batches for specific people. The mailman got a tin, the pastor got a tin, each grandchild's teacher got a small bag. The neighbor who watched her house when she traveled got 2 tins. These cookies were her currency, her way of saying thank you, her method of maintaining relationships. A tin of homemade cookies said things words couldn't, that you'd thought ahead, that you'd spent time, that the person mattered enough to receive something made with care. No beginning or end, like relationships that last. Whether she actually believed that symbolism or just liked the way it sounded, you were never quite sure. But the wreaths kept coming, year after year, her cookie press squeezing out edible representations of gratitude and connection. The press itself was temperamental. Too cold dough wouldn't press out smoothly. Too warm dough wouldn't hold its shape. The disc had to be attached exactly right, or the cookies would come out misshapen. But your grandmother had made peace with the press's quirks decades ago. She knew exactly how to load it, how much pressure to apply, how to get perfect wreaths every single time. These cookies weren't fancy in the way decorated sugar cookies were fancy, but they were precise, consistent, professional-looking. They showed mastery of a specific skill, competence with a particular tool. Some cookies showcased creativity. These showcased control. And speaking of control, wait until you see the next one. Why did the chocolate kiss have to go on while they were still hot? Your grandmother discovered these cookies in the 1950s when Hershey's Kisses became widely available and someone brilliant decided to press one into the center of a peanut butter cookie. The combination was perfect. Salty peanut butter cookie with a sweet chocolate center, the kiss melting slightly into the warm cookie, creating both visual appeal and flavor contrast. The dough was simple. Peanut butter, butter, both white and brown sugar, an egg, vanilla, and flour with baking soda. She'd mix it until combined, then roll tablespoons of dough into balls. Each ball got rolled in granulated sugar before going onto the baking sheet, creating a sparkly coating that would crack during baking. 8 to 10 minutes in the oven, and here's where timing became critical. The cookies had to come out while still hot, almost too hot to touch, because that's when the kiss went on. She'd unwrap kisses while the cookies baked, dozens of them, silver foil piling up, so she'd be ready the moment those cookies came out. Press, 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 a kiss into the center of each cookie while they were still soft enough to accept it, but firm enough not to collapse. The heat from the cookie would soften the chocolate slightly, making the kiss settle into the cookie, becoming part of it rather than just sitting on top. Wait too long, and the cookie would be too firm. The kiss wouldn't press in properly, would sit up high, would fall off later. These cookies were crowd pleasers. Kids loved them because chocolate. Adults loved them because peanut butter. The combination was American comfort food in cookie form. Nothing exotic, nothing challenging, just straightforward deliciousness. Your grandmother would make them for school bake sales because they moved fast. Those chocolate kisses sticking up made them instantly recognizable, made kids point and ask their mothers to buy those ones. They were profitable cookies, sold out early, made the PTA money. But she also made them at home, keeping them in a tin on the counter where anyone could grab one. They were generous cookies, meant for sharing, not hoarding. The peanut butter kept them substantial enough that one or two satisfied, unlike some cookies that disappeared almost before you'd finished eating them. "Chocolate and peanut butter," she'd say, unwrapping another kiss. "Some combinations just work." And this one really did. It had worked since the 1950s and would keep working because it was fundamentally sound. Good ingredients, good technique, good flavor balance. No amount of food trends or fancy techniques could improve on something this essentially right. The Betty Crocker version appeared in cookbooks by the 1960s, and the recipe hasn't changed because it doesn't need to. Perfect doesn't require updates. These cookies represented American innovation at its best, taking available ingredients and combining them in a way that created something new, something that would endure, something that would be made in kitchens decades later by grandmothers who weren't even born when the cookies were invented. Now, for the final cookie, the one that topped them all. Why did making these cookies take 3 days and feel like the most important baking of the year? Your grandmother's rolled sugar cookies were the grand finale of Christmas baking, the cookies that required the most time, the most patience, the most creativity. Day 1 was making the dough. Butter, sugar, eggs, vanilla, flour, baking powder, and salt creamed and mixed until it came together perfectly. The dough had to chill overnight, giving the flour time to hydrate fully, the fats to solidify, everything to rest before rolling. Day 2 was rolling and cutting. She'd divide the chilled dough into portions, rolling each portion to exactly a 1/4-inch thickness on a floured board. Too thin and they'd burn, too thick and they'd be cake-like. The cookie cutters came out. Stars, bells, trees, angels, Santa Claus, reindeer, snowmen, and cutting began. Each shape got transferred carefully to baking sheets, baked until the edges just barely turned golden, then cooled completely on racks. Day 3 was decorating, and this was where art happened. Royal icing in multiple colors, piping bags with different tips, small bowls of colored sugar, tiny silver dragées, patience measured in hours. She'd outline each cookie first, letting that outline dry, then flood the interior with thinned icing, creating a smooth surface. Once that dried, details got added. Faces, buttons, windows, stars, anything that made each cookie unique. This wasn't quick work. Each cookie could take 5 to 10 minutes to decorate properly. Multiply that by dozens of cookies, and you'd spend all day at the kitchen table, hunched over your work, icing bag in hand, adding dots and swirls and lines. But these cookies were worth it. They were showpieces, the ones you'd display before eating, the ones kids would look at with wide eyes, the ones that made people say, "You made these?" They were proof that someone had spent time, had cared, had created something beautiful just for Christmas. Your grandmother would package them in clear cellophane bags tied with ribbon, making each bag a small gift. Teachers got them, neighbors got them, church friends got them. They weren't just cookies, they were expressions of affection, symbols of effort, visible proof that someone had thought about you during the busiest season of the year. "These take time," she'd say, piping another snowman's face, "but that's why they matter. Anyone can buy cookies. Making them means something different." And she was absolutely right. These cookies said things that purchased cookies couldn't. They said, "I value you enough to spend 3 days making these." They said, "You're worth the effort." They said, "Our relationship matters enough to deserve my time and attention." The Betty Crocker version simplified them, suggested using less icing, recommended shortcuts. But your grandmother took no shortcuts here. These cookies got the full treatment because they deserved it, because Christmas deserved it, because the people she gave them to deserved it. Some cookies were about taste. These were about love made visible. These 30 cookies aren't just recipes. They're the Christmas memories our grandmothers baked into every batch. Which one takes you back most? Drop a comment sharing your favorite, and if you know someone who remembers these cookies, share this with them. These recipes deserve to live on, one batch at a time.